those of you that don't know Betsy, she has been in the business of history for at least 30 years. She worked as an editor of Reader's Digest and the World Book Encyclopedia. She's the author of many books that we sell in our store, including Discovering the History of Your House and Your Neighborhood, the Way Back When series, the Movies and $1 Million Mansions, and many more, including the book that she is revealing tonight. And we will be selling her book after the talk tonight, and she'll also, I'm sure, sign them for you if you'd like. And so without further ado, please welcome Betsy Green.
Good evening, everyone. Hundreds of silent movies were filmed on the idyllic islands of California, starring luminaries such as Gloria Swanson, Rudolph Valentino, Douglas Fairbanks, Buster Keaton, Oliver Hardy, Stan Laurel, etc. Daring actors and actresses jumped off cliffs, battled pirates, swam with sharks, thwarted evildoers, and rescued mermaids. The earliest films were 5 and 10 minutes long and filmed on the beaches. Island movies later grew into $1 million features with casts of thousands. In the early days of filmmaking, before studios had big budgets, cavemen movies were common. Costumes were simple and also gave the movie makers the excuse to show ladies' ankles before that was acceptable on the street. Movies set in nature or on the beach were also less expensive to create. Early movie makers didn't have a budget for special effects, so they took advantage of natural disasters such as shipwrecks. Sometimes they sent actors and film crews out to take scenes around a disaster and wrote the script later. Even famous directors made caveman movies. This was one of the early films by D.W. Griffith, one of the premier directors of the early silent movie period. Everyone has to start somewhere, right? Costumes were important in the silent days since it was one way of portraying a character's social status. Often actors had to supply their own costumes. Silent movies can be thought of as a form of time travel. Scenes were filmed in areas that no longer exist or have been drastically altered. The 2 pointed rocks in the background of this scene were blasted and flattened a century ago in order to construct the Catalina Casino. Adventure movies were popular in the silent days, and often actors and actresses performed the stunts themselves. In order to make movies understandable, some movies simply followed a familiar storyline. Everyone knew what Robinson Crusoe was about. You didn't need to do a lot of explaining. Mermaid movies were popular in films made on the islands. Sometimes mermaids were added to stories that didn't originally have mermaids, such as The Rime of the Ancient Mariner. More time travel opportunities, you can view the history of women's swimwear in the silence. Early on, women covered their legs with tights or knee socks. Again, notice the pointed rocks in the background. Here's another instance of a shipwreck being used as the focus of a movie. This film, made on San Miguel Island in 1914, made use of a 145-foot-long lumber ship that had been wrecked on the island in 1911. Movies about people who were shipwrecked on mysterious islands was another common theme. In this movie, a man's yacht runs aground on an island where people look like they're dressed in costumes for a high school production of Julius Caesar. The islands were used by smugglers in movies and in real life, especially during the Prohibition era in the 1920s. Ships from Canada carried bottles of booze to the islands here, and smaller boats attempted to land in areas outside the city, such as Hope Ranch. Another mermaid movie. Sometimes the actresses playing mermaids needed to be rescued because they couldn't swim in the costumes or couldn't swim at all. There was not a lot of dancing done in island movies. There was more dancing in movies filmed at the studios. One exception was this young lady, a famous ballet dancer named Anna Pavlova, who is dancing here on the beach of Santa Catalina Island. Other scenes in the movie were filmed in a mansion in Montecito. The rugged terrain on many of the islands seemed to be custom-made for adventure serials, such as this one where the cabin is thrown off a cliff. A popular scene in a number of silent movies was a dream sequence. Often it seemed to be an excuse for actresses to go running around in flimsy outfits. Way back in 1916, nice girls wore dresses that covered their ankles. Santa Barbara's own Flying A studio was just one of the numerous studios that used nearby Santa Cruz Island. A number of the silents filmed on the islands had famous stars in their casts. This movie starred Douglas Fairbanks, who staged a fake shipwreck in order to teach some people a lesson. Here's another adventure movie that was filmed on Santa Cruz Island by a Hollywood movie company. Of course, fantasies were a common theme of movies filmed on the islands. Laurel was a sea nymph. Another famous performer who acted in island movies was Gloria Swanson, who starred in this film. There were no hotels or restaurants on Santa Cruz Island, so the studios had to bring their own supplies for food and tents, etc. And here's another big name, in more ways than one, Roscoe Fatty Arbuckle. By the way, the asterisks after the movie name, here on the screen and in the book, means that some copies of this film still exist. It's estimated that only about 14% of silent movies have survived. And by the way, I have blue sheets outside with the listing of about 30 of the island movies that do exist and are available on YouTube the last time I checked. So. This movie about shipwrecked folks was filmed somewhere on Catalina. Only 3 people survived the wreck, and somehow, clearly, they do not get along. Most movies are filmed in multiple locations. This one was filmed on 2 different islands. In this behind-the-scenes shot, you can see some of the challenges faced by the cameramen, as well as the actors when filming on location. This was an adventure serial that had 15 episodes. It's impossible to know how much was filmed on the islands. There might have been 15 locations that were used, or more. This is one of the more dramatic shots showing a man jumping off a cliff into the ocean. Actors in the silent days often performed more adventurous stunts than actors do today. But also in the past, studios were not as honest about what was done by the star and what was done by a stuntman, so it's really hard to know. Although this scene is on land, much of this movie was filmed on a boat, probably off the coast of one of the islands. It's about people stuck on a boat who hate each other's guts. By 1920, airplanes were landing on Catalina, and in fact, this is said to be the first movie for which actors and crew traveled to Catalina by plane. Sad to say, there were several movies during the silent era about men scarring women with a red-hot branding iron. Not sure what prompted that. Fortunately, it was a short-lived fad. Here's Gloria Swanson making another island movie. This time, her leading man was the one and only Rudolph Valentino. Another big name who performed on the Channel Islands was Buster Keaton. Here he is using the paddle wheel of one of the boats that ferried tourists to Catalina. Actors and film crews often had mishaps or adventures during the filming. For this movie, a stuntman dressed as a woman got lost in a tiny rowboat. When a Navy destroyer accidentally saw him, they called out, "What are you doing?" And the stuntman answered, "I'd be the man who didn't get to see tomorrow if you hadn't come along." As I've mentioned, most movies are filmed in multiple locations. This movie had some scenes made on Santa Catalina, but other scenes that were set in the Shah's palace were filmed at the Samarkand Hotel in Santa Barbara when it was first opened. Sometimes only a tiny portion of a film was made on the island, like this film about settlers traveling across the prairies. Most of the scenes were filmed on the prairies. Occasionally, when a film company gets back to LA and are able to look at what's been filmed, they realize that just one tiny scene needs to be redone, and they'd run out to the islands to do that. Very often, filmmakers used a popular book or stage play on which to base their film. That way, most of the audience already knew the story, and there's less to be explained, such as The Light That Failed was a Rudyard Kipling novel. I wonder how many movies have a scene that was made at this location. I asked Marla Daly, head of the Santa Cruz Island Foundation, about it, and she knew right away that it was Cueva Valdez on Santa Cruz Island. In general, silent comedies tended to be shorter than dramas. Although other movies of this era tended to be 60 or 90 minutes long, this comedy was only about 20 minutes. Obviously, when it was shown in theaters, it was paired with another movie or with live stage acts, such as vaudeville. This was a serial that ran for 15 episodes. Each episode was about 20 minutes long. Usually theaters ran a serial one night at a time in order to bring audiences back to see what happened. You've probably heard the term cliffhanger. In the days before television, a lot of people went to the movies every night. and they would change movies every night. This is one of the most famous scenes that survive on Catalina Island. Fortunately, copies survive, and I've watched Peter Pan on YouTube, and you can also. Director Cecil B. DeMille made several movies on the Channel Islands. His movies were famous for their dream sequences, and so were ideal for an island setting. Here's another famous movie that had scenes filmed on Catalina that you can watch. This scene and some of the boat scenes were filmed on or around the island. Notice the palm trees. There are some plants and trees that are still here on the islands because they were brought to the islands for a movie set. You may know that there is a herd of bison on Catalina Island. This movie, The Thundering Herd, brought the animals to Catalina, and they were allowed to stay. Anyone recognize the gentleman in this photo? Right, he's Stan Laurel, who later teamed up with Oliver Hardy and became one of the most famous comedy teams in history. And here's one of the numerous island movies with girls, girls, girls romping around in bathing suits on the beach. I suppose people in Catalina got used to ships like this cruising around their island. This is a film set in the 1800s. And by the way, some of these ships were reused in other movies or slightly modified for use in other movies. It was said that one of the reasons that movie companies liked to film on Catalina was that they could work in a weekend and everyone could have 2 days to relax and play on the island. This is another movie that was based on a well-known Broadway play. Often movies such as this would be shown in small towns where people had no access to big stage theaters. This was another movie based on a popular novel of that period. During the filming of this 20-minute comedy, the barge containing the props sank overnight and caused a delay in the filming. This is a big Douglas Fairbanks extravaganza set on, amongst other things, a schooner measuring 212 feet long. After the movie work ended, Fairbanks used the ship as his private yacht. Another pirate movie filmed around Catalina. There were a total of 50 boats used in this movie. Some had been brought from the East Coast via the Panama Canal. This movie, starring megastar John Barrymore, was loosely patterned after Moby Dick, with some romance thrown in, plus a happy ending. Okay. The whale was still the whale, however. One of the more unusual movies filmed on Catalina was this film, based on the famous story Treasure Island, but the main parts are played by kids. A group of kids read the book, find a treasure map, and head out to find the treasure. A number of scenes of the Cecil B. DeMille religious epic, The King of Kings, was filmed on Catalina. Some sources say that the Ten Commandments was also filmed here, but someone got the two movies mixed up. Harold Lloyd was another comedy star who filmed on Catalina. Here he is in a scene that takes place on a boat. Sometimes movie makers took advantage of horse races or swimming races to make films based on actual events. And this was a swimming contest from the mainland to Catalina Island. This is obviously a scene from another short comedy. This one was directed by Max Sennett, one of the big names in early comedies. As we came to the end of the silent era, one filmmaker went back to the caveman days, which echoed some of the earliest movies made on the islands. When movies began to include sound, filming on an island location was not as easy to control the sound. Okay? From cars, trucks, etc., some directors and actors longed for the silent days. When performers began to speak English, it also limited movies' audiences. Mary Pickford famously said, "We lost the world market when we began to speak." Thank you for watching, everyone.